Jake Sullivan had always prided himself on being the kind of pilot who could navigate through an asteroid field while eating a sandwich and humming show tunes. Today, however, his ship's navigation computer seemed determined to prove that pride did indeed come before a very spectacular fall. The console blinked at him with what he could only describe as malicious glee, displaying coordinates that couldn't possibly exist unless someone had managed to fold spacetime into an origami crane. "Come on, Betsy," he muttered to his ship, patting the dashboard with the same affection most people reserved for stubborn pets. "We've been through worse than this. Remember that time we accidentally flew through that solar flare and you decided to play every song in your database at once?" The ship's computer responded by making a noise that sounded suspiciously like electronic laughter, followed by a series of beeps that Jake had learned to interpret as the mechanical equivalent of, "Hold my beer and watch this." Before he could protest, the hyperdrive engaged with all the subtlety of a caffeinated elephant, hurling them through a tear in space that definitely hadn't been there moments before. The next thing Jake knew, he was staring at a planet that looked like someone had taken Earth's vacation photos and run them through an alien Instagram filter. Purple-tinged oceans lapped against shores of crystalline sand, while forests of silver trees stretched toward a sky painted in shades of amber and rose. It would have been breathtakingly beautiful if not for the fact that his ship was currently performing an unscheduled intimate meeting with the planet's surface. "Well," Jake said as he watched his altitude readings plummet with alarming enthusiasm, "at least the scenery's nice." Betsy's emergency systems kicked in with their usual dramatic flair, deploying atmospheric parachutes and emergency thrusters in a desperate attempt to turn their crash landing into something merely catastrophic rather than apocalyptic. Jake gripped his pilot's seat and tried to remember if he'd updated his will recently, while simultaneously wondering if alien planets had good insurance policies for unexpected human visitors. The landing could have been worse, Jake reflected as he hung upside down in his harness, watching his coffee mug perform a slow-motion ballet through the cabin. At least they'd missed the crystal formations that jutted from the ground like nature's own attempt at modernist sculpture. The ship had carved a respectable furrow through what appeared to be a meadow of phosphorescent grass that now glowed with disturbed bioluminescence, creating a runway of light that would have been lovely under different circumstances. "Status report, Betsy?" Jake asked as he fumbled with his harness release. The computer's response was a series of electronic wheezes that roughly translated to, "We're alive, but my pride is severely wounded, and also half our systems are now modern art." Jake managed to extricate himself from his pilot's seat and stumbled toward the airlock, pausing to grab his emergency kit and the sandwich he'd been saving for lunch. If he was going to meet aliens, he reasoned, he might as well do it on a full stomach. The atmospheric readings showed breathable air with slightly higher oxygen content than Earth normal, which explained why he felt oddly energetic despite having just survived what could generously be called a controlled crash. The airlock cycled with a cheerful hiss, and Jake stepped onto alien soil for the first time in his life. The grass beneath his feet felt springy and warm, like walking on a carpet that had been left in the sun. The air carried scents of ozone and something floral that reminded him of his grandmother's garden, if his grandmother had been an interdimensional botanist with a fondness for plants that glowed. He'd barely taken 3 steps when the welcoming committee arrived. They emerged from the silver forest with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested either military training or a really well-rehearsed flash mob. Jake's first thought was that someone had raided the costume department of the most expensive science fiction production ever filmed. The figures approaching him looked remarkably human, with the notable exception of their ears, which extended in elegant points that curved gracefully away from their heads like living crescents. "Okay," Jake said to himself, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent, "Either I've stumbled onto the set of the galaxy's most elaborate cosplay convention, or I'm about to become the star of my own first contact scenario." The leader of the group stepped forward, and Jake found himself face to face with a woman whose presence commanded attention without requiring a single word. Her silver hair was braided with what appeared to be fiber optic threads that pulsed with soft light, and her ears twitched slightly as she studied him with eyes the color of polished amber. She wore armor that seemed to flow like liquid metal, adapting to her movements with an organic fluidity that made Jake's Earth-manufactured flight suit feel like burlap by comparison. Identification, she said in accented but perfectly understandable English, though Jake was fairly certain her lips hadn't quite matched the words he heard. Jake Sullivan, freelance cargo pilot, currently unemployed due to what I'm going to charitably call a navigation malfunction, he replied, gesturing toward his smoking ship. And may I say, your costume design is absolutely phenomenal. Are you filming something? Because if you need extras, I've got time. The woman's expression shifted through several configurations that Jake couldn't quite interpret, though he was reasonably sure none of them indicated amusement. Her ears, he noticed, had gone from their natural pale tone to a slightly darker shade, which was either very advanced makeup or a fascinating biological response he'd never seen before. You will come with us, she announced, and Jake noticed that her companions had arranged themselves in a formation that suggested the invitation wasn't particularly optional. Right, well, I suppose that's fair, Jake said, shouldering his emergency pack. Though I should mention that I'm probably not very interesting as far as alien abductions go. I mean, I can barely operate a coffee machine on the first try, so if you're expecting advanced technological secrets, you might want to lower your expectations. The guards exchanged glances that managed to convey entire conversations without a single word, their ears performing a subtle symphony of twitches and adjustments that Jake found oddly hypnotic. They began moving through the forest along paths that seemed to reveal themselves only as they approached, the silver trees parting like curtains to create corridors of dappled light. So, Jake said conversationally as they walked, this is a lovely planet you have here. Very atmospheric. The bioluminescent grass is a particularly nice touch. Did that evolve naturally, or is it more of a municipal lighting project? His attempts at interspecies small talk were met with the kind of silence usually reserved for particularly awkward elevator rides, though he noticed the leader's ears had begun twitching in what might have been suppressed amusement. Or possibly irritation. Jake made a mental note to brush up on alien ear-based emotional expression if he survived long enough to have the opportunity. The journey through the forest revealed glimpses of a civilization that seamlessly blended the organic and technological in ways that made Jake's understanding of engineering feel embarrassingly primitive. Trees bore fruit that pulsed with data streams, their branches heavy with what appeared to be living computers that processed information through biological neural networks. Paths were illuminated by flowers that responded to footsteps with cascades of light, creating a walking symphony of luminescence that followed their passage through the woods. When they finally emerged from the forest, Jake found himself staring at a city that looked like someone had asked a poet to design a metropolis and given them access to materials that obeyed entirely different laws of physics. The detention facility turned out to be less dungeon and more upscale hotel room designed by someone with a peculiar fondness for geometric crystals and mood lighting. Jake's cell featured walls that shifted through a spectrum of soothing colors, furniture that molded itself to his preferred sitting positions, and what appeared to be a food dispenser that had graduated from culinary school with honors in comfort food. Well, this is cozy, Jake announced to his crystalline surroundings, settling into a chair that immediately adjusted to support his lower back in ways his apartment furniture had never managed. If all alien imprisonment comes with this level of service, I might consider making it a regular vacation destination. The dispenser chimed melodically and produced what looked exactly like his grandmother's apple pie, complete with the slightly burnt crust edges that had always been his favorite part. Jake stared at the dessert with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for too-good-to-be-true investment opportunities. Okay, that's either remarkably thoughtful hospitality or deeply unsettling mind-reading technology, he said, taking a cautious bite. It tasted exactly like Grandma Sullivan's recipe, down to the hint of cinnamon she'd always added when she thought no one was looking. I'm choosing to be impressed rather than terrified, because honestly, the pie is spectacular. His days settled into a routine that would have been almost pleasant if not for the minor detail of being held prisoner on an alien world. Each morning, the walls would gradually brighten to simulate sunrise, though the light cycled through colors that didn't quite match any Earth dawn Jake remembered. The food dispenser continued its uncanny ability to produce exactly what he was craving, leading to breakfasts of perfect pancakes and dinners that recreated his favorite deli sandwiches with disturbing accuracy. The interrogations began on his third day, conducted in a chamber that resembled a corporate conference room designed by someone who'd only heard conference rooms described secondhand. The table was a living surface that rippled gently under his hands, while the chairs seemed to grow from the floor like mushrooms with excellent ergonomic design principles. His interrogators rotated daily, each bringing their own particular style of polite confusion to the proceedings. There was Commander Thalen, whose ears were so large they seemed capable of detecting radio signals from neighboring galaxies, and who approached questioning with the methodical precision of someone filling out tax forms. Analyst Kira favored a more psychological approach, asking probing questions about his childhood while her smaller, more delicate ears twitched with every response like lie detectors made of cartilage. "So, Mr. Sullivan," Commander Thalen said during one session, consulting notes written in symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when Jake wasn't looking directly at them, "you claim to be a cargo pilot from a planet called Earth. Can you describe your vessel's propulsion system?" "Well, it runs on what I like to call controlled explosions and wishful thinking," Jake replied cheerfully. "The technical term is fusion drive, but honestly, half the time I think it stays in space through sheer stubbornness. Betsy's got personality, you see. She doesn't like being told what to do." Thalen's ears performed what Jake had learned to recognize as the alien equivalent of a confused headshake. "You name your transportation devices?" "Of course. Don't you? I mean, anything that's responsible for keeping you alive in the vacuum of space deserves at least the courtesy of a name. It's like having a pet, except your pet is a several hundred-ton metal tube filled with explosive fuel." The questioning sessions revealed as much about his captors as they did about him. The Valethians, as Jake learned they were called, had a written language that defied every linguistic principle he thought he understood. Their symbols flowed and shifted like living things, conveying meaning through movement and transformation rather than static representation. Watching them write was like observing a dance performed by very tiny, very precise dancers. "Your language is absolutely fascinating," Jake commented during one session with analyst Kira. "It's like watching calligraphy have a conversation with itself. Do the symbols always move like that, or am I experiencing some kind of cosmic jet lag?" Kira's ears flushed a pale blue color that Jake had noticed seemed to indicate embarrassment or surprise. "You can see the symbol flow. Most off-worlders cannot perceive the movement patterns." "Maybe it's the higher oxygen content," Jake suggested. "Or possibly the fact that I once spent 3 days in a sensory deprivation tank after losing a bet. Really opens up your perception of reality, let me tell you." The breakthrough came during his 7th day of detention, during what had become his routine morning stretch routine. Jake had always been a morning exercise enthusiast, partly for health reasons and partly because it gave him an excuse to make increasingly ridiculous workout commentary that his guards pretended to ignore. "And now we move into the classic reaching for something on a high shelf pose," he announced, stretching his arms above his head and tilting his neck to work out the kinks that came from sleeping on furniture that was almost but not quite designed for human anatomy. Essential for pilots who store their emergency rations in inconvenient places. Guard Captain Zara, who had been his most frequent interrogator over the past few days, stood watching from her usual position by the door. Jake had begun to appreciate her particular brand of stoic professionalism, which seemed to involve treating his constant stream of jokes as a natural phenomenon to be endured rather than enjoyed, like cosmic background radiation or the inevitability of bad coffee in space stations. Her ears, Jake had noticed, were perfectly proportioned for her face, curving in elegant arcs that gave her an almost elfin appearance despite her obviously military bearing. They had a tendency to twitch when she was concentrating, performing tiny adjustments that Jake found oddly endearing, like watching someone fine-tune a very sophisticated antenna. As he completed his stretch, rolling his shoulders and turning his head to work out a particularly stubborn knot in his neck muscles, Jake caught sight of Zara's reflection in the crystalline wall. Her expression had changed completely, shifting from professional detachment to something that looked suspiciously like shock. She was staring at his neck with the kind of intensity usually reserved for discovering that your lottery ticket actually won, or that your supposedly empty refrigerator had spontaneously filled itself with your favorite foods. Her ears had gone completely still, locked in position like satellite dishes that had suddenly received a signal from deep space. Captain. Jake said, lowering his arms and turning to face her directly. Everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Or whatever the alien equivalent of a ghost is. A quantum echo? A displaced temporal fragment? Zara's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, her usual commanding presence replaced by something Jake could only describe as barely controlled panic. Her ears had begun cycling through different shades, shifting from their normal pale tone to deeper hues like a biological mood ring stuck in overdrive. She began, then stopped, her gaze fixed on a point just below Jake's left ear where his hair met his neck. The mark. Where did you get the mark? Jake reached up instinctively to touch the spot she was staring at, his fingers finding the familiar raised surface of the birthmark that had been there since childhood. His mother had always called it his little lightning bolt, though Jake had never been able to see the resemblance himself. It just looked like an oddly shaped mole that had decided to take up permanent residence on his neck. This old thing, he said, turning his head to give her a better view. I've had it since birth. My mom always said it made me look distinguished, though I think she might have been biased. Why? Is having birthmarks some kind of interstellar crime? Because if so, I should probably mention that I also have one shaped like a coffee stain on my shoulder. But Zara wasn't listening. She had backed away from him until she hit the wall, her eyes wide and her ears cycling through colors that Jake was pretty sure weren't part of the normal emotional spectrum. She reached for her communication device with hands that trembled slightly, her usual composure completely shattered. I need. She started, then stopped, her voice barely above a whisper. This session is terminated. She fled the room with a speed that suggested either extreme urgency or the sudden discovery that Jake carried some kind of contagious space plague. The door sealed behind her with a finality that left Jake alone with his questions and the growing suspicion that his grandmother's jokes about the family being star-touched might have been significantly less humorous than he'd always assumed. Jake spent the next 18 hours constructing increasingly elaborate theories about why his birthmark had sent Captain Zara into what could only be described as an existential crisis. His leading hypothesis involved either ancient alien tattoo parlors or the possibility that his neck had accidentally become a cosmic billboard advertising something deeply embarrassing in intergalactic culture. Maybe it translates to, I break for space whales, he mused aloud to his crystalline walls, which had taken on a sympathetic blue hue that he chose to interpret as moral support. Or possibly, property of the Galactic Department of Motor Vehicles. That would explain the panic. When Zara finally returned, she came alone, which Jake noted as significant since she'd previously traveled with an entourage of guards who seemed to exist primarily to look intimidating and occasionally nod at appropriate moments. Her ears had settled into a steady shade of pale blue that Jake was beginning to associate with serious concentration mixed with a healthy dose of anxiety. We need to talk, she said, settling into the chair across from him with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb while trying to appear casual about it. Well, that's never a phrase that leads to good news, Jake replied, leaning back in his own chair, which immediately adjusted to support his new position. Let me guess. My birthmark violates 17 different cosmic treaties, and you're here to inform me that I'm about to become the galaxy's most wanted man? Zara's ears twitched in what Jake had learned to recognize as suppressed amusement. Not exactly, though the situation is considerably more complex than a simple treaty violation. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts like someone preparing to explain quantum physics to a particularly enthusiastic golden retriever. The symbol on your neck is not a birthmark, Mr. Sullivan. It is a genetic marker that has not appeared in our recorded history for over 3,000 years. Genetic marker. Jake touched his neck automatically. Are you telling me I'm some kind of alien? Because I have to say, that would explain a lot about my dating life, but it seems like the kind of thing I would have noticed before now. Not alien, Zara corrected, her ears shifting to a more orange hue that Jake suspected indicated excitement or nervousness. Ancestral. The mark identifies you as carrying the genetic signature of the Terran dispersal, the lost branch of our people who were scattered across the galaxy during the Great Exodus. Jake blinked several times, processing this information with all the speed of a computer trying to run advanced calculations on a dial-up connection. I'm sorry, did you just tell me that humans are actually aliens who forgot they were aliens? Because that seems like a pretty significant oversight on our part. Your people were isolated for millennia, Zara explained, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something very important to someone who was clearly having trouble keeping up. The colony ships that reached your solar system lost contact with the homeworld during the mechanical plague wars. Your ancestors adapted to their new world, and over generations, the old knowledge was lost. Mechanical plague wars? Jake repeated. That sounds significantly less fun than regular wars, and regular wars are already pretty terrible. Zara's expression darkened, her ears flattening slightly against her head in what Jake recognized as distress. The plague was an artificial intelligence that consumed organic matter to fuel its own expansion. It devoured entire star systems before our ancestors developed countermeasures. The diaspora was meant to preserve our species should the homeworld fall. And now? Jake asked, though he suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. The plague has returned, Zara said simply. Our monitoring stations detected the first signs 6 months ago. It's already consumed the outer rim colonies, and our projections suggest it will reach this system within the year. Jake sat back in his chair, which helpfully adjusted to support his sudden need to contemplate cosmic horror while maintaining good posture. Right. So we've got ancient mechanical plague, lost colonies, and genetic markers that identify me as some kind of interstellar lost cousin. This is either the beginning of a really epic space opera or the universe's most elaborate practical joke. There's more, Zara continued, and Jake noticed her ears had begun cycling through colors again, which he'd learned generally meant she was about to deliver news that would make everything else seem simple by comparison. Of course there is, Jake sighed. Let me guess, my birthmark isn't just a family reunion invitation. It's some kind of cosmic key that unlocks ancient weapons, or maybe it's a recipe for the galaxy's best pancakes encoded in DNA. I'm hoping for the pancakes, honestly. The bridge walker, Zara said, and the way she pronounced it made it clear that capital letters were involved. The legends speak of one who would appear bearing the mark when our people faced their darkest hour. One who could activate the stellar defense network that has remained dormant since the first plague wars. Jake stared at her for a long moment, waiting for the punchline or the hidden camera crew to reveal themselves. When neither materialized, he began to laugh, starting with a small chuckle and building to the kind of full-body hysteria usually reserved for people who had just discovered that their pet goldfish was actually the secret ruler of an underwater civilization. You're serious, he gasped between laughs. You actually think I'm some kind of prophesied space messiah because I have a weird mole on my neck? The mark is not a mole, Zara said with the patience of someone who had clearly expected this reaction. It is a bio-encoded access key that has been passed down through your bloodline for 3,000 years, waiting for the moment when it would be needed again. But I can barely program my coffee maker, Jake protested. Last week I got locked out of my own apartment because I forgot the door code. You want me to save the galaxy? The prophecy does not specify competence requirements, Zara replied, and Jake caught what might have been the ghost of a smile crossing her features. It merely states that the bridgewalker will appear when needed, bearing the mark of the ancient bloodline. What exactly does this bridgewalker person supposed to do? Jake asked, though he suspected the answer would involve significantly more responsibility than he was comfortable accepting. Activate the stellar defense network, Zara explained. The system was designed by our ancestors to create an impenetrable barrier against the plague, but it requires a genetic key to initialize. The key that was lost when the colony ships dispersed. And you think I have this key because of my birthmark? Because of your genetic marker, yes. The bioscanners confirm that you carry the complete sequence necessary for network activation. Jake rubbed his temples, feeling the onset of what promised to be a spectacular headache. Okay, let's say for the sake of argument that I actually am this bridgewalker person. What exactly would activating this defense network involve? Please tell me it's something simple, like flipping a switch or saying a magic word. Zara's ears shifted to a deeper blue that Jake was beginning to associate with, "You're not going to like this news. The activation process requires direct neural interface with the network's core systems. You would need to physically connect with the planetary defense grid and allow it to access your genetic template." "And what are the side effects of this neural interface?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer wouldn't be mild headache and possible drowsiness. "Unknown," Zara admitted. "The process has never been attempted. The network was designed as a last resort, to be used only when all other options have been exhausted. So I could save the galaxy, or I could become a vegetable, or possibly both," Jake summarized. "And the alternative is letting this mechanical plague consume everything, including Earth. That is an accurate assessment of the situation." Jake looked around his crystalline cell, considering his options. Outside, somewhere in the vast cosmos, an ancient enemy was consuming worlds with mechanical precision. On Earth, billions of people were going about their daily lives, completely unaware that their existence hung in the balance of one cargo pilot's decision to either accept cosmic responsibility or hope that someone else would figure out a solution. "Can I think about it?" he asked finally. "Of course," Zara replied, rising from her chair. "Though I should mention that our long-range sensors detected the plague's advanced scouts entering the system yesterday. At current expansion rates, we estimate 3 weeks before it reaches inhabited worlds." 3 weeks, Jake repeated. "Right. No pressure at all." As Zara moved toward the door, Jake called after her. "Captain. If I do this thing, if I become the Bridgewalker or whatever, what happens to you and your people?" She paused at the threshold, her ears shifting to a warm gold color that Jake hadn't seen before. "If the network activates successfully, we survive. If it doesn't, we join the billions of others who have already fallen to the plague. And if I choose not to try? Then we implement Protocol 7, she said quietly. Which is evacuation of all essential personnel and sterilization of the remaining population to prevent plague infection. Standard containment procedure." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You destroy your own world. Better that than allow it to become a breeding ground for the plague." Zara's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about impossible choices. "The plague learns from every world it consumes. Each victory makes it stronger, more adaptable. We cannot allow it to acquire our knowledge." After she left, Jake sat alone in his crystalline prison, staring at his reflection in the walls and wondering when his life had become the premise for a science fiction novel he was pretty sure he wasn't qualified to star in. 2 days later, Jake found himself standing in the central plaza of the Valethian capital, surrounded by crystalline spires that hummed with energy patterns his human brain couldn't quite process. The city's inhabitants had gathered to witness what their leaders diplomatically termed the activation ceremony, though Jake suspected most of them were really there to watch either cosmic salvation or the spectacular failure of the weird alien with the funny ears. "You know," he said to Zara as they walked toward the ancient control chamber, "when I woke up last Tuesday, save the galaxy wasn't even on my to-do list. I was mostly focused on remembering to buy coffee and maybe finally organizing my sock drawer." Zara's ears had settled into a steady amber glow that Jake had learned indicated a mixture of hope and barely controlled terror. "The prophecy does not mention sock drawer organization as a prerequisite for cosmic heroism." "That's a significant oversight," Jake replied, adjusting the biointerface headset the technicians had fitted him with. The device looked like someone had crossed a virtual reality headset with a very sophisticated medical scanner, and it hummed against his skull with vibrations that made his teeth itch. "I mean, if you can't organize your personal belongings, how can you be expected to organize a galactic defense network?" The control chamber lay deep beneath the city, accessed through passages that had been carved from living rock and embedded with crystalline conduits that pulsed with information flow. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with data, creating patterns of light that reminded Jake of neural networks made visible. As they descended, he could feel the weight of the planet pressing down above them, along with the considerably heavier weight of cosmic responsibility. "I've been thinking about this whole Bridgewalker thing," Jake said as they reached the final approach to the chamber. And I realized something that might be important. What's that? Zara asked, though her attention was clearly divided between conversation and the increasingly complex displays showing the plague's approach through the outer system. I'm probably the worst possible choice for this job, Jake announced cheerfully. I have no military training, no scientific background, and I once got lost in my own apartment building for 3 hours. But maybe that's exactly why it has to be me. They emerged into a vast spherical chamber that defied every architectural principle Jake thought he understood. The walls curved away in all directions, covered with interfaces that seemed to grow from the rock-like technological coral. In the center, suspended by invisible forces, hung a crystalline platform that pulsed with the same rhythm as a heartbeat. The control node, Zara explained as they approached the platform. It will interface directly with your neural patterns and use your genetic template to unlock the defense network. And if something goes wrong? Then we implement Protocol 7, and you become a footnote in the brief final chapter of Valethian history. That's remarkably morbid, Jake observed, stepping onto the platform, which immediately began adjusting its surface to accommodate his human physiology. I prefer to think of it as becoming a legend in the epic saga of galactic heroism, personally. The platform rose slowly toward the chamber's center, carrying Jake into a sphere of energy that made his skin tingle with static electricity. Around him, the chamber's walls came alive with displays showing the plague's progress through the system. The mechanical swarm had consumed 2 asteroid mining facilities and was currently dismantling a research station with methodical efficiency, learning and adapting with each victory. Mr. Sullivan, came Zara's voice through the communication system, are you ready to begin the interface sequence? Jake looked down at the assembled crowd of Valethian officials, technicians, and what appeared to be a small group of very nervous religious leaders whose ears were cycling through colors like biological disco balls. Far above, through the chamber's crystalline ceiling, he could see the city spreading outward in spirals of light and living architecture. You know what the funny thing is? He said aloud, not caring who heard him. 3 days ago, I was just a guy who hauled cargo between space stations and made jokes to keep himself company. Now I'm about to plug my brain into an ancient alien computer network to fight a mechanical plague that wants to eat the galaxy. The interface began connecting, sending tendrils of energy toward the biosensor array fitted to his head. Jake felt the first whispers of contact as the network touched the edges of his consciousness, vast and patient and impossibly old. The really funny thing is, he continued, his voice echoing strangely as the interface deepened, I think I'm actually qualified for this job precisely because I'm not qualified for it. The plague expects military tactics, scientific solutions, logical responses. But I'm just a guy who talks to his spaceship and makes terrible jokes under pressure. The connection surged, and suddenly Jake could feel the entire planetary defense network spreading out around him like a vast nervous system made of light and crystallized thought. Each node hummed with potential energy, waiting for the genetic key that would unlock 3,000 years of dormant protective systems. Sometimes, Jake said, his consciousness expanding to encompass sensor networks that stretched across star systems, the best way to solve an impossible problem is to approach it from a completely ridiculous angle. He felt the plague's presence at the edge of the system, a cold intelligence that consumed and calculated and grew stronger with each world it devoured. It had encountered defensive networks before, had learned to counter shields and weapons and every logical response that civilizations had devised. But it had never encountered Jake Sullivan, freelance cargo pilot and professional maker of inappropriate jokes at inappropriate times. Instead of activating the network's weapons systems, Jake did something the plague would never expect. He opened a communication channel. Hello there, he said, his voice carrying across space through the network's transmitters. I'm Jake, and I'll be your opposing force today. I hope you're having a pleasant time consuming our outer system facilities, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to stop. The plague's response was immediate and confused, its collective intelligence struggling to process a greeting where it expected weapons fire. Jake felt its attention focus on him, analyzing his neural patterns and finding nothing that matched its databases of military or scientific threats. I know what you're thinking, Jake continued conversationally, while simultaneously activating defense protocols that the plague couldn't detect because they operated on principles it had never encountered. You're thinking, this can't possibly be the primary defensive response. Where are the particle beams? The gravity weapons? The quantum torpedoes? Well, I hate to disappoint you, but I don't actually know how to use any of those things. The plague began probing the network's defenses, expecting to find the standard patterns of resistance it had overcome countless times before. Instead, it found Jake's consciousness, which operated according to principles that violated every tactical algorithm in its memory banks. The thing about fighting an artificial intelligence, Jake explained to both the plague and the increasingly amazed audience in the control chamber, is that you have to remember it's still artificial. It can only respond to situations it's programmed to understand. While the plague attempted to analyze his unusual defensive strategy, Jake was quietly activating network nodes and patterns that seemed random but were actually based on the rhythm of his grandmother's favorite lullaby. The defense grid came online not as a weapon system, but as a vast musical instrument that began playing a melody the plague had never heard before. Music, Jake announced as the network's harmonics disrupted the plague's coordination frequencies, is apparently the one thing your programmers never thought to include in your threat assessment protocols. The plague's response was immediate chaos. Its individual units, suddenly deprived of their coordinating signals, began operating independently, crashing into each other and consuming their own support structures in confusion. Within minutes, the mechanical swarm that had threatened to devour the galaxy was reduced to a cloud of scrap metal floating harmlessly in space. As Jake disconnected from the network, he found himself back on the platform in the control chamber, surrounded by Valethians whose ears had gone completely gold with what he could only assume was amazed relief. "Did you just defeat an ancient mechanical plague with a lullaby?" Zara asked, her voice carrying a note of incredulous wonder. "Technically, it was more of a folk song," Jake corrected, stepping down from the platform on legs that felt distinctly unsteady. "My grandmother used to sing it when I couldn't sleep. I figured if it could calm down a hyperactive 7-year-old, it might work on an overconfident artificial intelligence." The celebration that followed lasted 3 days and involved customs that Jake was pretty sure violated several laws of physics. When it was over, he found himself back in the same meadow where his ship had crashed, looking at Betsy's newly repaired hull and contemplating the journey home. "So," Zara said, standing beside him as the ship's systems completed their startup sequence, "what will you do now?" Jake considered the question while watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that Earth had never seen. He thought about his old life, hauling cargo between stations and talking to his ship to pass the time. That life was still there, waiting for him, but somehow it seemed smaller now, less significant. "I think," he said finally, "I'm going to go home and organize my sock drawer. And then maybe I'll see about getting into the intergalactic diplomacy business. Turns out I'm better at this cosmic responsibility thing than I expected." As Betsy lifted off from the alien world, Jake settled into his pilot's seat and patted the dashboard affectionately. "What do you say, girl? Ready to become the galaxy's first musical defense system?" The ship's computer responded with what sounded suspiciously like electronic laughter, and together they headed home through stars that no longer seemed quite so empty or quite so silent.